Okay, great. I'll get started. Welcome everyone to this IES webinar, How the Net Zero Target Can Be Supported Through Strategic Environmental Assessment. We're delighted today to be joined by Susanne Underwood. Susanne is an Associate Environmental Planner at LUC, an award-winning environmental consultancy providing planning, impact assessment, landscape design and ecology services to a wide range of public and private sector clients. With over 20 years in planning and research, Susanne has particular experience of undertaking national level SEA for the Scottish Government covering energy, land use and climate related plans. After Susanne's presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and these will then be read out on your behalf later on. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available on the IES YouTube channel. Thank you so much for logging in today, and thanks to you, Susanne. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, Ethny. That was great. Thank you. So I'm Susanne Underwood. I'm an Associate Environmental Planner and I work for LUC. I work within the field of strategic planning and I've got particular experience of both SEA and SA, so that's Strategic Environmental Assessment and Sustainability Appraisal, alongside a range of other research and policy-based work. So moving on to the presentation for today. As explained in the introduction, today I'm speaking on how the net zero target can be supported through SEA. And again, as set out in the introduction, I'm going to explore it through these three main questions. So just to explain that when I'm looking at the first question, which is what role can SEA play in helping to achieve net zero, I'm just going to explain a little bit of the key components of the SEA process and its purpose for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And then we'll move on to look at the challenges and how we can make SEA count. So again, within the context of understanding that not all of you may necessarily be familiar with the SEA process, which can be undertaken alone or as part of the sustainability appraisal or an integrated assessment. I'm not going to go into the detail of the legislation behind why we do SEA. I'm just looking to sort of lift out the key messages about it and net zero in the time available. So I'm going to run through the SEA process at a high level to provide context. So why do we do SEA? So obviously SEA is seeking to identify significant impacts on the environment from a plan or policy. It's meant to be a process which enhances plan and policy making. So it's meant to bring forward a better outcome. And it can be a powerful tool, although it doesn't always work as well as it possibly should. So again, we've all got a role in helping that to work better. SEA, it provides a different perspective on a plan, which can be really useful. It requires you to consider reasonable alternatives, which again is about making people think differently about what they're trying to achieve. And it identifies opportunities for mitigation and enhancement. So in terms of what makes an effective SEA, I would say that timing and integration with the plan and policy making process is really important. If you get the timing wrong and you have the SEA process sort of playing catch up to a plan or policy, you lose the value of the process. And again, if you start it too soon, you don't have enough detail. And again, that means you can't meaningfully make assessment and draw conclusions. You also need the people who are drawing up the plan or policy to be receptive to the SEA process, and they have to sort of want to make it work and be ready to take on board what it's saying. It's also meant to be an iterative process. Again, there can often be challenges within this in terms of time constraints and the timing of the SEA and the plan or policy making, timetables for consultation, things can get constrained. But I would say that the greatest value from SEA is that it can be very useful in challenging the plan or policy making process. And it just sort of brings a different perspective, which can be very valuable. So in terms of explaining the SEA process, again, again, some of you will be familiar. It includes a number of stages, from screening, scoping, preparing the environmental report, through to the post-adoption statement and the monitoring framework. But this presentation is going to focus on the assessment element, which informs the preparation of the environmental report. So firstly, we need to understand the environmental baseline, and this provides the information against which you are assessing the effects of the plan or program that you're assessing. Again, so this is about information gathering that's relevant to the content and purpose of whatever it is that you're assessing. Again, if you're not aware of this, SEA is structured around 9 SEA topics, which are principally environmental, but obviously also include the human element in terms of population and human health, and the resources element in relation to material assets. So in terms of how an assessment is undertaken, the approach can be tailored to the plan, and therefore different approaches can be used in different contexts. There is a general preference for using SEA objectives and assessment matrices, but again, this isn't necessarily right for every plan. So SEA objectives are informed by the plan content and the policy framework for that plan or policy. And there's an example shown here below. These are the SEA objectives that the Scottish Government used in the SEA of the National Planning Framework 4, which is due for publication imminently. So you can see they've kept those quite strategic and high level about avoiding new greenhouse gas emissions, reducing existing greenhouse gas emissions, and then also covering adaptation, because climatic factors covers adaptation as well as emissions. So using SEA objectives and an assessment matrix, it provides a clear and transparent record for the assessment process. And it also provides flexibility for updating the assessment as the plan policy content changes, which it inevitably does. So again, you can then chop and change matrices if elements drop in or out. So in terms of the SEA process and how it works and the assessment, again, it's about understanding the assessment needs to work with the content of the plan which you're looking at. So you firstly need to identify the elements of the plan or policy that you're looking at, which are going to be assessed. You might think that is easy. Sometimes different structures of documents, they can be sort of different elements can be slightly buried within those. Not everyone always clearly identifies the elements that you need to assess. You are seeking to identify significant environmental effects. So this is, the overall purpose of the process. But significance is a challenging element of SEA. I mean, again, there's lots of guidance on how you might assess significance, but it can be positive or negative. It can vary in location and context. If you have a particularly sensitive environmental receptor, then that might change the significance. And you also need to think about significance in terms of the combination of several minor effects and what that might mean. Reasonable alternatives, obviously, key part of the process, and they need to be assessed in the same level of detail as the other elements of the plan. And again, as I said, in relation to cumulative effects, you also have to consider secondary and synergistic effects, looking across what's been identified. So I included this slide just to sort of try and emphasize that SEA is meant to be an iterative process. So again, as I've said, time constraints can affect how that actually works in practice, but draft content should be assessed, identifying potential environmental effects and mitigation enhancement that could be included. And the intention is that the draft plan or policy should be modified, and then a revised material is produced. And this can theoretically happen a number of times. Again, like I said, in reality, time constraints can play an important role in how this actually plays out. So once the assessment has been undertaken, the next phase is the reporting. So these are presented in the environmental report. So the assessment is undertaken, and then this is summarized in the environmental report text. There's different ways of presenting this. It can be by SEA topic or different elements of the plan, depending on if you have different topics within a plan, you might present it that way. It has to present the findings of the assessment and also of the reasonable alternatives. Again, pull out those cumulative, secondary and synergistic effects and identify mitigation enhancement and set out the monitoring requirements. So starting to think about, to focus in a little bit on climatic factors and how we can use SEA to help achieve net zero. So again, as we set out, climate change is considered under the climatic factors SEA topic. We're going to focus in on what this actually means. Again, I'm sure that you will all be very aware that climate impacts can arise from a wide range of potential sources, and these need to be captured consistently within the SEA process and the climatic factors, because there's a risk that some of these emissions can be sometimes identified under other SEA topics, and then they're not adding up to that overall. These are the total climate emissions impacts of this plan or policy. Again, SEA, a lot of the topics are interlinked. So there's a lot of things going on, obviously. So there is climate change in terms of emissions, there's climate change impacts, and there's also climate change adaptation. So focusing on net zero, again, potential sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of electricity, you might want to think about how it's being generated, efficiency in its use, the construction materials of energy generating infrastructure in terms of wind turbines or solar panels. In terms of transport, there's lots of things you can think about here. So it's the number of journeys, what fuel's being used by the vehicles that are relevant to your plan or policy, what's the efficiency of those vehicles and the journeys that they undertake. In relation to buildings, how we heat and light our homes, what are the sources we're using for those? How efficient are those buildings? How are those buildings built? What are the materials involved? In terms of industry, again, some of these topics are more relevant or less relevant to different types of plan or policy. What's the power source? What are the raw materials? What's the waste that's being generated? Land use change in forestry. So again, there's lots to think about within this category. If you're changing a land use, what does that mean in terms of emissions? Agriculture, again, a big source of emissions. Again, what's affecting the different sources within agriculture, or the amount of waste and how that waste is used. And then finally, waste and the circular economy. Again, how waste is managed, but also what waste is being generated. So all of these things can be impact positively or negatively on climatic factors relative to the baseline. And again, as I said, climatic factors also needs to consider climate adaptation, and there can be overlap between mitigation and adaptation. For example, green infrastructure, which might be developed as part of active travel routes. It provides adaptation benefits in terms of cooling, air quality and biodiversity, but it also helps to reduce transport emissions. But again, we also need to then consider the the construction of that infrastructure and the emissions associated with that. Okay, so just to sort of summarize a little, so we're looking to identify significant emissions. You need to think about emission sources quite widely, but within the context of what's important relative to the plan or policy. Again, think about land use, carbon stores, processes that sequester carbon. How big are these impacts, and what's the time frame of some of these emissions? Again, just to highlight, high carbon construction, if you've got big infrastructure projects, you might have a longer payback period. So these are important things to think about. So for this next slide, and the next few series of slides, I'm going to talk through a theoretical example, which is quite typical of local plans, to illustrate some of the considerations which the SEA can address. And so the scenario is you've got a development plan and it's proposing an area of new housing development. So I've just put down some prompts in terms of what you might be thinking about in this scenario. Again, reflecting back on some of the things that we covered in relation to the topic areas. So, you're going to have some new houses built. How are they going to be heated and powered? Are they using renewable or low carbon heating? What are they building these new properties from? What are the properties of these materials? Are they low carbon or recycled? Again, you're not necessarily going to know the answers to these questions. At a strategic level, proposing new housing, you're not going to have detail, but starting to ask these questions is really important, because it can provide a trigger to say, well, how else are we ensuring that these things are considered through this plan or policy? So moving on from sort of those considerations in terms of the construction and operation of the buildings, thinking about land use and biodiversity. So was the site greenfield or brownfield in terms of where you're proposing to put it? What does that mean for soil carbon? How dense is the development? Are you making the most efficient use of land? What vegetation was already on the site? What's being lost? So in terms of trees or hedgerows or other sort of potential carbon stores. And then in terms of, again, what will be implemented alongside the development, what new habitat may be being created and what's the potential carbon sequestration of that. And just in relation to the greenfield brownfield consideration, again, if a site is potentially contaminated, again, think about the emissions associated with remediating that land. It's just sort of all different things that could actually influence the decisions and the conclusions that are being made. And then lastly, just sort of thinking about the transport aspects in terms of this new development. How accessible are key services? How well connected is the site? Is any new public transport or active travel networks or routes proposed? And again, we then need to think about all the other variables associated with this. You need to think about how people's behavior will influence that, because you could have a very well connected site, which for some reason is still people choose to travel by car. And there are different evidence bases out there about people's the barriers and how much people will take up active travel options. So just something else to think about there. So I'm just going to illustrate with an example next of some work that we did for South Tyneside, just looking at how you might potentially generate additional information to help inform the SEA process. So within South Tyneside, they've declared a climate emergency, and they wanted to ensure that emerging local plan reflected that. So we did some additional work for them, which was looking at the potential emissions associated with these different spatial options for where they could locate new development. And this was within the context of the wider sustainability appraisal that they were undertaking. So sustainability appraisal would normally look at a whole range of factors relating to accessibility to public transport. So in this example, it's specifically the metro stations. But then in order to try and understand how this affects actual travel behaviour, we then took this another step further. So just to explain this illustration, so these are very crude sort of distance buffers to the metro stations, which are the yellow squares, and the green area shows locations which are within 750 meters of those. So thinking about other data sources that can provide information, we've looked at census data, which can give you information on people's different commuting patterns, how far they're going and what mode of transport they're using. So this was used to estimate emissions per journey using a standard emission factor. So again, this was then combined in the next illustration to show how people's actual travel patterns relate to their proximity to public transport modes. So in this illustration, you can see that the pale yellow areas are those which have better public transport access, and people are more likely to use public transport to travel, to commute within those areas. Within the darker areas, again, these areas have poorer public transport and people are less likely to use sustainable modes of travel. So the blue areas, these are all the potential locations for site allocations, new development. So, I mean, this is just an example of how you can use additional information to help inform the SA process, to give you a little bit more sort of nuance and understanding of how you might use that within the SA or the SEA process. But obviously there are some limitations within this. It's based on census data, which is now out of date. Obviously we've had lockdown, we've all had changes in working patterns. It also uses, as the crow flies, distances, which again can be unrealistic depending on local geography and sort of roads and rivers and things like that. It's just an example of how additional information can be used to give a slightly more focused assessment. So I'm now going to sort of consider some of the challenges for SEA within climatic factors. So I'm just going to go through the different stages of the SEA process. So I'm going to look at the baseline, look at those related to the plan or policy that's actually being assessed. And then I'm going to end with my takeaway thoughts on how to make climate considerations count in SEA. So in relation to baseline, like I say, this forms the information against which the assessment is based. Finding the most appropriate baseline information can be challenging. There's often data gaps, which may be specific to the assessment. There can be differences in data scale. So sometimes additional work may be needed to understand the climate impacts of a plan or policy. Again, as you're working through the assessment process, it often throws up questions. So although you set out your baseline information at the start, this is something that needs to be changed when you suddenly realize, like, hang on a minute, we need to know this. How do we find that out? The plan or policy itself can also be quite a challenge for climatic factors in SEA. So again, this is to do with the development process of these, because climate impacts can be hard to quantify if you have a very strategic level policy or action, and there can be a huge amount of uncertainty about how where, when, the detail of the materials, the construction, all that about how it's going to be implemented. And again, as we alluded to earlier, there can be uncertainty about the actual effect of a change. You might be introducing new travel routes, active travel routes, but you don't know how well they're going to be used. So all of this affects your ability to judge significance, because you're making judgments based on partial information, which may be partial in terms of the baseline, what's actually going to happen through the plan or policy, and things like that. But again, this is strategic environmental assessment. So again, the detail must be proportionate to the plan or policy that you're assessing and the nature and scale of the effect that's being identified. However, I would stress that it's very important to take a precautionary approach through the assessment, and not to make too many assumptions that, again, living within the environment that we currently do, that things will be done well. Of course, we will have X standard of insulation in those new properties. SEA, again, can say, well, unless something's been legislated, or an area has committed to meeting certain standards, you can't actually be sure. So this is sort of one of the traps that people can fall into in an assessment. It's like, oh, we're assuming that they're going to do this or that, but you have to question if that's really going to be the case. So in terms of doing the actual assessment, like I say, once you've assembled your baseline, once you've understood your plan or policy, you need your SEA objectives to be right, and this helps you to ensure that the SEA will achieve the greatest benefits. And like I say, you need this clarity about what's being assessed under climatic factors. Like I say, if you've got, an area with a lot of peat in it, and you've got the emissions associated with changes to your peatland or the quality of your peatland under soil, then there's a chance that the climatic factors information could miss those out. So again, it's just to stress about bringing all those emissions information together. So as we sort of trying to illustrate through this presentation, identifying emission sources is an area of complexity and uncertainty at many different levels. I say the scale of the emissions that are going to arise from a particular plan or policy, again, many uncertainties in relation to the assessment process. Avoiding double counting, again, I've said about making sure you don't lose emissions under other SEA topics, but neither should you double count them. Be clear about where they are being assessed. And also trying to keep that assessment strategic and focused, and recognizing what SEA can or can't do. So just my final slide, just trying to summarize how we can make climate considerations in SEA count. I would say prioritize climatic factors in the assessment. It's a big topic. It needs to have a high profile. I think that we are hopefully seeing this. Climatic factors used to be somewhere down the list of the SEA topics. Obviously, it should now be upfront. Secondly, this point about being clear about where climate impacts are reported, make sure they're not lost with these other SEA topics. Consider the relevant baseline information and data that's being used. I mean, poor data is a big challenge. There's probably a lot of opportunities to provide better quality data, bit of data analysis. So I think that's a potentially really interesting area that can enhance the role of the SEA. Demand better plans and policies. Again, this just alludes back to the fact that sometimes objectives can be a bit vague, they're not always clear enough. we need that to know that we are making a difference. I mean, SEA can measure the direction of change, but sometimes people want to know a little bit more than that. So we just need clarity and as much information as possible in terms of plans and policies. Using effective climate SEA objectives. So again, just need to make sure the SEA is actually asking the right question. Mitigation and enhancement. This is your best opportunity to improve a plan or policy. So it's about saying, oh, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? This could make it better, or this could reduce these adverse effects. And then finally, trying to develop meaningful monitoring mechanisms. Monitoring is recognized as an area which is particularly challenging for SEA. Again, it's what can you measure, and how can you attribute any changes in that measurement to the plan or policy. So yes, in summary, the SEA can play a very important role in enhancing the plan and policy making process. But again, there's a whole load of considerations in here. It's reliant on people being receptive to the purpose of SEA and the outcomes that it generates. Thank you. We'll now move on to the questions.
Thank you so much, Susanne, for that presentation. That was really interesting. So thank you for that. And yes, please, any attendees, please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll kick straight off. We've got one in that's just come in. Which software do you use to assist in your analysis and production of graphs and comprehensive maps? We may have data and fail to analyze them effectively.
Well, it very much depends on the nature of the SEA that's being undertaken. So for local plans, we would use GIS software for the analysis, like the example that I showed. Is that what's being asked?
Perfect, thanks, Susanne. And in terms of the data, you mentioned sometimes there can be an issue with the poor baseline data that you use. What do you think are the challenges to getting high quality data, or what some of the reasons for this?
Well, I mean, quite often, again, it depends on the plan or policy that's being assessed. Sometimes it might be quite niche. So again, because I've looked at a lot of sort of strategic level plans, I guess the key challenges are in terms of data that fits the scale of the plan or the policy that you're looking at. Or you may find that there is some data, but it might not include everything that you're looking at. It's very variable. I think there isn't a sort of, it's very specific to what you're looking at.
Great, thank you. And is monitoring, does it have to be part of the SEA process, or is it more of a kind of like people do it if they can?
It is a requirement of the SEA process, but like I say, it is one that a lot of SEAs fall down on, and it is recognised as challenging because, again, I think it's that mismatch between the scale of the plan and the amount of change that you would expect to see. So yes, that is one of the challenges. If it was something very specific, you know, a different type of plan, you might be able to tailor monitoring more effectively. You know, if you've got an aspiration to increase the amount of electric cars in your area, you would look at the number of, you know, charging points you've got, for example, or, you know, the number of EV cars that have been purchased. But there's a lot of things where you haven't got a neat match between what you're trying to measure and what you can use to measure that.
And oh, just one that's just come. And are you finding that there's resistance to the SEA process by developers?
I can't speak about developers because I'm usually working with plan or policy makers. I don't know if there have been instances where they've disagreed with the SEA process or not. Again, there is obviously, like I say, some of the data that you have to use is clunky. It might be, you know, it's obviously not based on real life information, but it is a strategic assessment. So there's only so much that you can expect. So again, I think the comeback is it's a strategic assessment. It's trying to identify generally what the issues are as far as possible. And yes, if you're a developer, you might have very specific issues which don't quite fit with the level of SEA.
And given the kind of breadth of topics that can fall under SEA, and like you said, you work with policymakers quite a lot, what do you think are some of the success factors to interdisciplinary teams communicating with each other or trying to communicate to policymakers some of the key science that comes out of the SEAs?
Well, I mean, although science obviously has an important role to play in terms of the data and the understanding, SEA is very much a qualitative assessment. I mean, there are instances where it can be much more qualified, and there are examples of where, we have used, set factors in terms of like, distance to transport and things to sort of automate the process a little bit in terms of sites and things. But I think it's much more about how the policymakers understand what SEA is trying to ask, trying to do, and to think about, what other information would actually add quality to the development of that policy or plan.
That makes sense. Thank you. And the other question here is, you mentioned that it should be, if everything was going properly, an iterative process in terms of the SEA. You mentioned time as one of the problems that can arise in making that a bit more iterative. Are there any other challenges, do you think, to improving how iterative they are?
I would say that time is the biggest factor, particularly because when people aren't familiar with the SEA process, they don't always realise the statutory consultation periods. They don't start the SEA process soon enough. But again, quite often there can also be, again, this does relate to time, but people have very clear ideas about what they expect the plan or policy to say, and it's almost finalised before it's been put through the SEA process. So again, it's about making people understand that, yeah, your work in progress is useful and don't feel you have to finalise it, but there is that balance between enough detail and they've almost signed it off.
And how would rapidly changing government influence the effectiveness of SEA?
That's a difficult question. But we've still got our climate change targets. We are still committed to those. So I think it's perhaps a case of carry on regardless. We know that we can, we're working towards these targets. SEA can contribute to those. So I think we need to focus on the end goal and maybe not take too much notice of the sort of the short-term issues.
Good answer. Thank you. Is the nature of SEA as conducted at a regional level, for example, for policy setting, and at an individual project level, are they different? And if so, how?
Well, you wouldn't typically undertake SEA at a project level. Slightly different circumstances in terms of when SEA is carried out for different plans in different locations. But again, you wouldn't often look at an SEA for anything below local authority level. Sorry.
Are they ever done on a broader scale than at the local authority level?
Yes. Again, we've been working with the Scottish Government quite a lot. So again, national level policies get SEA'd. So yes, that's again, that's a very different level of information and detail. So there's very much a zoom in, zoom out type approach within the SEA. And I think, again, that's particularly interesting in Scotland because we actually have the SEA Gateway, where they actually have a central place where they hold examples of all SEAs which go through the system, which is a really useful resource for people looking to understand, what an SEA for, a very local level bit of guidance might look like compared to the SEA of a national level plan or policy. So that's a really good resource that we're very lucky to have.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was going to ask about that kind of a database of examples. And with these examples, do they give any information about how the SEA has led to any change in kind of or improvement in plans and policies?
Well, that should be clear through the post-adoption statements. So the post-adoption statement sets out how the findings of the SEA were taken into account, and they show all the different stages within that database. The different documents are shown on that, and you could then see that. Obviously, something's still in progress. It might not have got to that stage yet.
Perfect, thank you. And final question we've got time for today, the last one that's just come in, is how can we improve how evidence collated in SEA and SEA conclusions translate through and are used in project level assessments, for example, EIA?
Again, I would possibly say that you're looking at different data sources because you're working at very different scales. I would suggest that yes, there might be some data which can be used at project level, but again, you just have to be very careful about how you could match the relevance between those different things, because they are different assessment processes based on very different levels of detail. So yes, hopefully my colleague Joanna will expand on that in a few weeks at the EIA level.
Exactly, that segues us on nicely to the next IES webinar. We'll be exploring this same question, but from the EIA perspective. So please do register for that. That's on the 10th of November, and you can register on the IES website. Thank you so much for coming today, Susanne, and giving us that presentation. It was really useful to hear about the role of SEA and net zero policy. So thank you for that. That's it from us today. Thank you everyone for logging in. I hope you found that beneficial and informative. If you're an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance on the IES TPD tool. And a reminder to go and have a look at our events page and register for any upcoming webinars. Thanks again, Susanne. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.